Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at web accessibility.
Yeah.
And this is something that, we here at SparkFlow,
Yeah.
we're really passionate about. We're web design fanatics.
Yeah.
And,
Absolutely.
the more we learn about web accessibility, the more we realize it's
Yeah.
not just something that's nice to have,
Right.
but it's really like a smart
It's a must-have.
business decision
Yeah.
that can have a real impact on your ROI.
Yeah, it's becoming less and less of a best practice and more of just like a necessity for businesses, especially in today's digital landscape.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me when I was reading through our recent blog post,
Yeah.
The Ultimate Guide to Web Accessibility,
Yeah.
was this statistic that 61 million people in the U.S. alone have disabilities.
Wow.
That's a huge market.
Yeah.
And, we know that a lot of businesses are missing out on this market
Right.
because their websites just aren't accessible.
Yeah, and not just that, but then you also open yourself up to a lot more risk. Legal risks, brand reputation, all of that can be really detrimental, especially for startups that are, in their growth phase. Those kinds of setbacks can be pretty costly.
Yeah, so let's dive in. Let's talk about these POUR principles. These are really kind of the bedrock of web accessibility.
Exactly, yeah. So POUR stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust. And each of these principles really focuses on a different aspect of making sure that your website is user-friendly. So if somebody can't perceive your content or operate the website or understand the information, or if the website's not robust enough to work on different devices and browsers, they're not going to have a good experience.
Right, and they're not going to stick around.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's break it down a little bit.
Yeah.
Perceivable, that seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
It's just making sure that users can actually access the information on your website.
Right.
Whether that's through sight or hearing, other senses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a good example of that is alt text for images. So for somebody who's using a screen reader, alt text provides a description of what that image is, so it makes it accessible to people who are visually impaired. But then on the flip side of that well-written alt text also helps with SEO because search engines use that to understand what your images are about.
So we're already seeing here how accessibility and just good business practices kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, they really do.
So what about Operable? What does that entail?
Operable really focuses on how people navigate and interact with your site. So making sure that your website is fully navigable just using the keyboard, not only a mouse.
Okay.
Making sure that you have clear and consistent navigation menus, your forms are intuitive and easy to use, and you're avoiding things like flashing images that could trigger seizures in certain people.
Okay, so understandable. I'm guessing this is just about making sure that the language on your website, the layout is clear and easy to grasp.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that everything's really clear and easy to digest. And this is especially important for people with cognitive disabilities. You want to avoid jargon, organize your content in a really logical way, use consistent language throughout the site, that kind of thing.
And then lastly, robust.
Yeah.
This is all about making sure your website is built to last. It's adaptable as technology evolves.
Yeah, that's right. So a robust website's going to play well with all the different browsers and assistive technologies and devices that are out there. So that means clean code, semantic HTML, staying up to date on all the latest standards. It's really just an investment in the long-term health of your site.
And I would say the long-term accessibility of your website.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about the POUR principles and how they're not just about ticking a box for compliance. It's really about building a better website experience for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about some of the business benefits. I mean, we've hinted at some of those already.
Yeah.
But our blog post really highlights 4 key benefits, starting with legal compliance.
Yeah.
This one seems like kind of a no-brainer, especially for startups who, might not have a ton of resources to throw at legal battles.
Right. Yeah. ADA lawsuits are on the rise. And they can be incredibly costly, not only financially, but also to your brand's reputation. Tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And for a startup, that could be make or break. So by being proactive about accessibility, you're really mitigating that risk.
Yeah, and nobody wants to be known as the company that excludes.
Yeah, exactly.
A huge chunk of potential customers.
Right. And that brings us right to our second benefit, which is improved user experience. Accessible design generally means a better experience for all users, which in turn is going to lead to longer site visits, higher engagement, more loyal customers.
It's about creating a website that people actually enjoy using,
Exactly,
which
yeah.
I think is a huge win.
For sure. And I think that's even more important for startups who are really trying to make a name for
For
themselves.
sure.
Um, and that kind of leads us to our third benefit, increased audience reach. We talked about that statistic of 61 million people with disabilities in the US. So by making your website accessible, you're opening yourself up to this massive market that a lot of your competitors are probably overlooking.
It's a huge potential for growth.
For sure, yeah.
You're really tapping into this hidden gold mine of potential customers
Yeah,
and
exactly.
revenue.
And then the fourth one, the fourth benefit, which might not be quite as obvious, is better SEO performance. A lot of these best practices for accessibility kind of go hand in hand with best practices for SEO. So for example, using descriptive alt text for your images not only makes those images accessible for people who use screen readers, but it also helps the search engines understand what your content is about, which is going to help your rankings.
So it's like a win-win.
Yeah,
You're
exactly.
improving accessibility and boosting your SEO at the same time.
Exactly. You're getting more organic traffic, your visibility is going to increase, you're going to be driving more potential customers to your website.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't want that?
Exactly.
So we've talked about the why of accessibility. Now let's get into a little bit of the how.
Okay. Yeah.
What are some of the common issues that you see
Yeah.
websites facing when it comes to accessibility?
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of those practical solutions?
Yeah. So let's break it down by user group. So let's start with people with visual impairments.
Okay.
That could range, anywhere from color blindness to low vision to complete blindness. One of the most common issues that we see is low contrast between text and background colors. So imagine trying to read light gray text on a white background. It's a nightmare.
Right.
But luckily, it's an easy fix. Just make sure that you have sufficient contrast between those text and background colors. Make sure that your content is readable.
Okay, what about images? We talked about alt text earlier.
Yeah.
But are there any other considerations there?
Yeah, I mean, you want to make sure that you're not using images as the sole way to convey information. If you have to use an image, make sure that you have a text equivalent.
Got it.
And for alt text, just make sure it's really descriptive and it conveys the actual meaning of the image. Don't just write image or graphic. That doesn't really help anyone.
Right, okay. So we've talked about visual impairments. What about auditory impairments? What are some of the things that you see there?
Yeah, for people with hearing impairments, the biggest hurdle is going to be accessing any sort of audio content. So videos, podcasts, anything that relies primarily on sound.
Right.
So the solution there is to provide captions and transcripts
Okay.
for all your audio content. So captions are going to provide that text version of whatever audio is playing. And then the transcript's just going to be the written record of all the spoken words.
So it's really about making sure that people who can't hear
Mm-hmm.
can still access the information. You know, it's funny is that I find myself using captions all the time, even though I don't have any hearing impairments.
Right.
You know, if I'm in a loud environment, I don't want to disturb the people around me.
Yeah.
So it's really helpful for everybody.
Exactly. Yeah. Accessibility really benefits everyone, not just people with disabilities.
Okay, so let's move on to motor disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the challenges there?
Yeah, so for people with motor disabilities, probably the biggest challenge is going to be navigating and interacting with your website using a mouse or a trackpad. So think about people who have cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy. Those precise mouse movements can be really difficult.
Yeah.
So the key here is to make sure that your website is fully navigable using just the keyboard.
Okay, so someone could theoretically go through your entire website, access all the content,
Mm-hmm.
do things like fill out forms using just the tab key,
Exactly.
the enter key,
Yeah.
the arrow keys.
Yeah.
And again, this is another example of where accessibility benefits everyone. You know, a lot of like power users really prefer keyboard navigation.
Right. It's much more efficient.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're not only making your website more inclusive, but you're also appealing to these users who really value efficiency.
Okay, and then lastly, let's talk about cognitive disabilities.
Yeah.
This is a broad category.
It is, yeah.
But what are some of the challenges
Yeah.
that people might face in this area?
Yeah, so for people with cognitive disabilities like dyslexia or ADHD, processing information, navigating complex layouts can be really, really difficult. So imagine you're trying to focus on a website. It's super cluttered, uses complex language. There's flashing animations everywhere.
Right, it's overwhelming
Exactly. It's totally overwhelming.
for anybody.
Right. So the solution is to keep things simple. Simplify your language. structure your content really logically, and try to minimize those distractions.
So we're talking about using clear and concise language,
Mm.
breaking up the content into smaller chunks.
Using headings and subheadings
Yeah.
really effectively to guide people through,
Exactly.
and just avoiding all that unnecessary
Yeah.
clutter and distractions.
Exactly. And again, these are all good design principles in general. A website that's easy to understand and navigate is going to benefit everyone.
Okay, so now let's talk about actually testing these websites for accessibility.
Okay, yeah.
How do we know if we're hitting the mark?
So there are three main methods of accessibility testing: automated testing, manual testing, and user testing with people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And ideally, you're going to want to use a combination of all three of these methods to get a really well-rounded picture of your website's accessibility.
Okay.
But let's start with automated testing.
Okay, so what are those? How do they work?
Yeah, so automated testing tools are software programs that essentially just scan your website for accessibility issues. They can identify things like missing alt text, low contrast, broken keyboard navigation, things like that. And there are a ton of great tools out there, both free and paid. Google Lighthouse is one that's really popular, and that one's free.
So these are kind of a good starting point for a quick and easy assessment.
Yeah, but it's important to keep in mind they're not perfect. They're really good at catching those more technical errors, but they can't really assess the overall user experience or identify those more nuanced accessibility issues.
Okay, so that's where manual testing comes in.
Yeah, exactly. So manual testing involves actually going through your website page by page and checking for those issues yourself. You can use a checklist of accessibility criteria or try navigating your website using just your keyboard to see if you run into any barriers.
Okay, so it's much more hands-on.
Yeah,
It takes a little bit more time,
it does.
but it's much more thorough.
It is.
Okay, and then what about user testing?
Yeah, so user testing with people with disabilities, this is really the gold standard of accessibility testing. It involves having people with disabilities actually use your website and give you feedback on their experience. It's super valuable because you're really seeing how real users interact with your website, and you can identify those barriers that you may have missed otherwise.
So it's like getting feedback straight from the source.
Exactly.
But I imagine this could be a little bit challenging to coordinate.
It can be, but it's definitely worth the effort. There are organizations out there that specialize in recruiting users with disabilities specifically for this kind of testing. And there are also some online platforms that make it easier to connect with testers remotely.
So if you're really serious about accessibility, this is the way to go.
This is the way to go, for
Right.
sure. Now let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about how we can actually build accessibility into the design process right from the get-go. Because it's much easier and more cost-effective to incorporate it from the beginning rather than trying to fix it after the fact.
So what are the key steps?
So there were four main steps: planning for accessibility, designing with accessibility in mind, developing those accessible features, and then testing and maintaining. And we're going to get into each of those in more detail in part 2 of our deep dive.
Great. Can't wait to hear more about putting these principles into action. We'll be back after a short break to continue our deep dive into web accessibility and how it can benefit your business.
Sounds good. Welcome back. Let's pick up where we left off and talk about how to actually build accessibility into your design process right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, this is crucial, especially for startups that are, building their websites from scratch.
Right.
I mean, it's got to be a lot easier and more cost-effective to think about this stuff up front.
For sure. Yeah, you're going to save yourself a lot of headaches down the road if you just kind of address this right from the beginning,
Yeah.
rather than trying to retrofit it later.
Right, exactly.
So as we mentioned, there are those 4 key steps: planning, designing, developing, testing, and maintaining.
Okay.
So let's start with planning.
Okay, so what does that actually entail? What does it mean to plan for accessibility?
Well, it really all starts with just setting clear accessibility goals and standards from the very beginning of your project. So that means, identifying who your target audience is, understanding what their potential needs might be when it comes to accessing your website, and then figuring out which accessibility guidelines you're going to be following. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, are a good place to start.
So it's really about creating a roadmap for accessibility, making sure everybody on the team's on the same page.
Exactly.
Right from day one, whether you're a designer, a developer, a content creator, everybody understands why this is important.
Yeah, for sure. It's going to save you so much time and energy later on if you just kind of set those expectations from the very beginning. Okay, so once you have a solid plan in place, then you can move on to the next step, which is designing with accessibility in mind.
Okay.
And this is all about considering those needs of users with disabilities in every step of that design process.
So how do you actually do that? I mean, what are some practical ways that designers can incorporate accessibility into their design choices?
Well, for starters, you want to make sure that you're choosing color schemes that have enough contrast. We talked about how important contrast is for users with visual impairments. Make sure that there's enough contrast between the text and the background color so that everyone can read it easily. Also, clear and concise language is key. You want to avoid using any jargon or overly complex terminology. Keep your sentences short and sweet.
Right.
Get to the point. Use headings and subheadings to break up those big walls of text.
So you're creating a clean, streamlined design that's really easy to navigate and understand,
Exactly.
regardless of a user's ability.
Exactly. So think about like intuitive navigation menus, clear calls to action, a really logical flow to the structure of your site.
Right.
These are all good design principles in
Okay.
general.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've designed this beautiful, accessible website.
Okay.
How do our developers actually bring those designs to life
Right.
in a way that's still accessible?
Yes.
So this is where developing accessible features comes in. So our developers, they need to be using the right code, the right techniques, making sure that the website's compatible with all these assistive technologies like screen readers
Right.
so that people with disabilities can actually use it.
So what are some examples of some of those techniques? What should developers be thinking about here?
Well, one really great place to start is using semantic HTML.
Okay.
So this is basically just using HTML elements for their intended purpose. So for example, using heading tags
Okay.
like H1, H2 to structure your content. Not only is that going to make it easier for users to scan and understand the content, but it also helps those screen readers navigate your website more effectively.
Okay, so it's not just about, making things look pretty on the front end.
Right.
It's about using the right code
Exactly.
to the right job.
Another really important technique is to use ARA attributes. So these are basically attributes that you can add to your HTML to provide more information to those assistive technologies.
Okay.
So for example, you can use ARIA attributes to like define the role of an element
Okay.
on the page, or to like indicate the state of an interactive element, like whether a button is pressed or not.
Okay, so it's about providing those extra layers of information
Mm,
that might not be visually obvious,
right,
but are really important for people who are relying on those assistive technologies.
exactly. And then finally, ensuring keyboard accessibility.
Right.
Super, super important. Our developers need to make sure that users can navigate, every single element of the website, all the features,
Okay.
interactive features, everything, using just their keyboard.
Right, and we talked about how that's not just for people with disabilities. It's just
Mhm.
a nice feature in general.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of people just prefer to use their keyboard.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the development side of things. And then the final step is testing and maintaining.
Okay, so this sounds like it's an ongoing process. This isn't just a one-time thing.
Nope, definitely not a one-time thing. Testing and maintaining accessibility is so crucial for making sure that your website stays accessible over time. Because your website, it's a living thing. It's constantly evolving and growing as you're adding new content, new features, new functionality.
So it's not enough to just test for accessibility at the beginning of the project.
Nope.
You need to make it an integral part of your development process. Making sure that every new feature, every new piece of content that goes live on your site has been vetted for accessibility.
Exactly, yeah. And you're not only catching those errors,
Right.
but you're actually looking for ways to improve the accessibility of your site on an ongoing basis. So, regularly review your website, make sure that you're staying up to date on all the latest accessibility guidelines, be responsive to user feedback.
So it's really about creating this culture of accessibility within your organization,
Mm-hmm.
where it's not just an afterthought, it's a core value that's reflected in everything you do.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about how to implement accessibility on existing websites.
Okay, yeah. I'm sure this is a big concern for a lot of our listeners who have websites that were, built maybe before they really understood the importance of accessibility.
Yeah, for sure. And luckily, you don't have to start from scratch. There's definitely like a structured approach that you can take to bring your existing website up to speed. And honestly, even if you have a relatively new site, it's still a good idea to go through this process and just make sure that you've covered all your bases.
Okay, so what's the first step? Where do you even begin if you have an existing website that you need to make more accessible?
Well, the first step is to conduct a thorough accessibility audit. Think of it as like a health check for your website.
Okay, and how do you actually go about doing that?
Well, you're going to want to use a combination of all those testing methods that we talked about earlier. So the automated testing tools, remember, those are a good starting point, but they don't catch everything. You're also going to need to do some manual testing and ideally user testing with people with disabilities to really get a comprehensive understanding of where your website stands.
Okay, so you're really gathering data, you're identifying any potential issues, you're just getting a really clear picture of where you need to focus your efforts.
Exactly. And then once you have a really good understanding of what those issues are, you can start to prioritize them based on their impact and their severity. You don't have to fix everything all at once.
Right.
Just start with those most critical issues, the ones that are creating the biggest barriers.
Right.
And then you can kind of work your way down the list.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And as you start making those improvements, you're going to start to see all those benefits that we talked about.
Right.
Increased audience reach, improved user experience, better SEO performance.
Yeah.
It's really just about making your website a much more welcoming and engaging space for everybody. And as you're implementing these changes, it's also really important to document everything that you do.
Okay, so why is documentation so important in this process?
Well, it helps you track your progress. It ensures consistency
Right.
across your website,
Right.
and it can make it a lot easier to maintain that accessibility in the long run, especially as your website continues to evolve.
So you're creating this record of the changes that you made, why you made them, how they impacted the accessibility of the website.
Exactly.
So if anybody ever has any questions, they can refer back to that.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of maintenance, remember, accessibility is not a one-time project. It's an ongoing commitment.
Right.
It's really about baking it into the DNA of your company,
Yes.
making it a core part of how you approach web design and development.
Yeah, exactly. And by doing that, you're not just creating a more inclusive website. You're really opening up your business to this wider audience. You're enhancing your brand's reputation.
Yeah,
You're really driving business growth.
for sure.
I mean, it really is a win-win situation for everybody. Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've talked about these POUR principles, all the business benefits of web accessibility, common issues, and how to solve them, testing methods, and even how to build accessibility into your design process from the ground up.
Right.
But where can our listeners go to learn more? Where are the resources? How can they actually put all this into practice?
Well, there's a ton of information out there, but I think one of the best places to start is the W3C website.
Okay.
That's the Worldwide Web Consortium.
Oh.
They're kind of the guardians of web standards.
Right.
And they have a ton of information on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
Okay, WCAG.
WTCAG,
Yeah.
exactly.
We've mentioned those a few times.
Yeah.
Can you give our listeners a little more context on those? What are they? Why are they important?
Yeah, for sure. So WTCAG is basically the internationally recognized standard for web accessibility.
Okay.
So they outline these very specific criteria that websites should meet in order to be considered accessible.
Okay.
It's kind of like the rule book for building an inclusive online experience.
Okay, so if our listeners want to really make sure that they're hitting the mark, they should familiarize themselves
Yeah,
with those guidelines.
absolutely.
And the good news is
Yeah.
it's all available for free online.
Yeah.
You don't have to pay
Yeah.
anything to access this information.
Yeah, you can find it all right there on the W3C Ed website. It's readily available to anybody.
Great. And we've also talked about how important it is to actually be testing your website for accessibility.
Yes.
Are there any specific tools or resources that you recommend for that?
Yeah, definitely. There are so many great accessibility testing tools out there, both free and paid. We talked about Google Lighthouse,
Right.
which is a fantastic free tool that can just give you kind of a quick overview.
Right. A good starting point.
Yeah, but there are other tools out there as well, like Wavy, Axe, and many others that provide a more in-depth analysis and can really help you pinpoint exactly what those issues are.
So there's really no excuse
Yeah.
not to be testing your website for accessibility.
Exactly, especially now with all the tools that are available.
Exactly. And you know what else? don't underestimate the power of community.
Oh, yeah.
There are so many online forums, communities, social media groups
Absolutely.
that are dedicated to this topic.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's a great place to connect with other professionals.
Mm-hmm.
Share knowledge, ask questions, get advice.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like having this whole network of accessibility experts at your fingertips.
Exactly, yeah. And then, of course, if you really need more hands-on support, if you just want to talk to some experts who really live and breathe this stuff,
Right.
you can always reach out to a web accessibility consultant or an agency like SparkFlow.
Well, there you have it, folks.
Uh,
A shameless plug,
yeah.
but we truly believe
Yeah.
that we can provide the expertise
Mm-hmm.
and the guidance that you need
Absolutely.
to make your website truly accessible.
Yeah, we really do eat, sleep, and breathe web accessibility
Yes, we do.
here at
We're
SparkFlow.
passionate about it.
Yeah.
Um, so just to kind of wrap things up,
Okay.
I just want to reiterate that web accessibility is not just about compliance.
Yes.
It's really about creating a better online experience for all users.
Exactly.
It's about tapping into a wider market, strengthening your brand's reputation,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately driving business growth.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is the right thing to do.
Well said. I mean, by embracing web accessibility, you're not only creating a more inclusive website, but you're really making a difference in the world.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive today. We hope you found this deep dive informative and inspiring, and we encourage you to go out there and explore some of the resources that we've mentioned and start your own accessibility journey today.
Yeah, absolutely. Building an accessible web is a team effort. Let's all work together to make the digital world a more inclusive space for everybody.
And until next time, keep diving deep.